There is a war going on in Gaza, and there have been a lot of civilian lives lost in a short period of time. I have to wonder, why has nobody suggested saving those Palestinians by letting them take refuge in Israel? Is it that unthinkable? On October 7, 2023, Hamas carried out an unprecedented terrorist attack that killed about 1,200 people in Israel and took over 200 hostages. Most of these people were civilians, though about a quarter to a third were military personnel. In response, Israeli forces began a campaign nominally intended to eliminate Hamas within the occupied territory of Gaza. Operations are ongoing as of now, and there is growing international discomfort with a large number of Palestinian civilians that have been killed. The most generous estimates, based on the Israeli claim of a ratio of 2 civilians to 1 combatant killed, would suggest over 13,000 civilians have been killed. Other estimates put the number closer to 20,000 or even more. There is a lot of talk within and among governments and in the media about how to save Palestinian lives in Gaza. The obvious option is an immediate ceasefire, but I think everyone can understand that's not going to happen. There are, generally speaking, 3 options that are routinely presented that go beyond a simple call for a ceasefire. These options, which are essentially pro-Israeli talking points, are the following. 1. Hamas should just stop using civilians as human shields and surrender to Israel. 2. Israel should use more precision targeting of Hamas fighters to minimize civilian casualties. And 3. Egypt should let them into the Sinai. Each of these options has obvious problems and is likely infeasible. The first option more or less blames Hamas for the large number of civilian casualties. The main problem with the human shield issue is that, given the high population concentration of Gaza, the presence of civilians is almost impossible to avoid unless explicit efforts are made to evacuate them before engaging. Hamas is probably incapable of doing that. Israel does make an effort, but considering the results, it's obviously inadequate. As for Hamas simply surrendering, I think that's equivalent to suggesting Israel should just give up. The second option suggests the weight of responsibility for saving Palestinian civilians should be put on the means Israel uses to engage Hamas. It's important to note that this option has been brought forward as a result of the correlation between the demographic composition of the population of Gaza and the deaths being reported, which implies that Israel is not discriminating between civilians and combatants. Considering the bulk of the fighting is in urbanized spaces, and it is fairly clear that there is no place for civilians to shelter safely within Gaza, civilians will continue to be killed at a high rate regardless of Israeli tactics unless they are able to move out of Gaza. So the third option proposes that Egypt allow Palestinians to evacuate Gaza into the Sinai. This seems to be the preferred solution of at least some members of the current Israeli government, and more shockingly, some American analysts who really should know better. Of course, Egypt has refused to accept Palestinian refugees. Considering the historical experience of doing otherwise in Lebanon and Jordan, I think the Egyptians have every reason to expect this would be a permanent relocation, which, by the way, would constitute ethnic cleansing by the Israelis. I also suspect that if this were to happen, the same would be attempted in the West Bank. I doubt I'm alone in thinking this. And maybe everyone should also worry about the fate of the 2 million Palestinian Israelis. There is every reason to believe pursuing this option will lead to an escalation of the war beyond the boundaries of Israeli-occupied territory. So what's missing here? If the goal were to save lives, there is an elephant of an option that I have yet to see anyone suggest. Israel could evacuate civilians into Israeli territory. They could have done that at the beginning of the war, and they could still do it now. I think it's pretty obvious looking around the world that moving millions of people is something that is feasible and logistically sustainable. Whatever Israeli security concerns may exist can certainly be accommodated by putting limits on what refugees can bring with them and guarding them during their stay. This isn't some kind of overwhelming challenge for a country like Israel. Keep in mind, over 1 million Gaza residents moved from north to south within Gaza. This was done under the impression created by Israel that they would be safe there. It probably would have been easier to move them through the fence and provide them with basic needs inside Israel, and they'd be safe. At the same time, this would have made battling Hamas a lot easier, since a much higher proportion of those who remained would likely be affiliated with Hamas. I'm also sure the UN could be enlisted to provide humanitarian aid for these Palestinians, and I get the feeling that Palestinian civilians would probably not doubt their right to return after the fighting, which, given their history, is an understandable concern. What doesn't exist is a will to even consider the possibility of saving Palestinian civilians by having them move outside the battle space. I haven't seen this suggested by anyone, not once. Instead of moving them to somewhere that's actually safe and plainly accessible, Palestinians are being told to move from one supposedly safe place in Gaza to another and another. Somehow, it seems unthinkable that Palestinian civilians should be allowed to go somewhere that's actually safe. I doubt there would be nearly as much international discomfort if Israel made this gesture to protect Palestinian lives. The fact is, no one even considers it. Given how concerned everyone supposedly is about the number of civilians being killed, particularly women and children, I find that rather disturbing. Anyway, that's my opinion. I don't see any way to justify the high death toll in Gaza without incredible mental gymnastics. There's no tactical, operational, or strategic reason for it. If you really want to save Palestinian lives, let them have temporary refuge in Israel.